This episode of Metatrex is brought to you by Enterprise in Space. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter. Visit enterpriseinspace.org for more information. And if you'd like to help us keep Star Trek discussion coming to you each day, consider becoming a patron of the network through Patreon. Visit patreon.com/trekfm and find out how you can become part of the team. That's patreon.com/trekfm.
Hi, I'm Manu Ntereme. I played Icheb on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Metatrex on Trek FM.
There's no greater challenge than the study of philosophy.
My philosophy is that there is room for all philosophies on this station.
Well, welcome everyone to episode 56 of Metatrex, Trek FM show on Star Trek and philosophy. My name is Mike Morrison, and with me, as he always is Zachary Fruling. Today we're going to be talking about essential Trek philosophy from Season 6 of Star Trek Voyager. Zachary, how are you doing today?
Well, I'm actually doing much better. I think I've sufficiently recovered from my bout of Tarkalian flu that had me down for the count for the last couple weeks.
Well, Zachary, I'm really excited about this today. Not only are we going to be discussing what I believe to be one of the best seasons of Star Trek Voyager, but we're going to be joined by a special guest today, our associate producer here at Metatrex, and one of your co-hosts over on To the Journey, Kay Shaw. And the Transporter Chief tells me that they are ready, so Transporter Chief, energize. Kay, welcome to the Starship of Theseus. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm excited. I've been listening to Metatrex for ages, so excited and slightly nervous to be here, but yeah, it should be fun.
Kay, we're really excited to have you on. You've been with us on Metatrex for quite a while now as our associate producer, and who would have guessed that when you joined us as an associate producer here on Metatrex that you and I would be hosting To the Journey, Trek FM's Voyager show together. So we've been looking for a reason to bring you on Metatrex for quite a long time, and since we're doing essential Trek philosophy from Season 6 of Voyager, we thought it would be a great chance to have you join us for once.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it.
We are as well, and I'm still trying to lobby our art director Aaron Harvey to get that T-shirt idea that you came up with made. Everything that I learned about philosophy, I learned from Metatrex. I love that. That's a great idea. Aaron, if you're listening, come on, man, throw us a bone.
Well, another friend of mine actually who was chatting to Zachary the other day, she said she'd love that T-shirt as well. So.
Well, we need to get that made and get that over in our Redbubble store, where you can find a lot of great Trek FM merchandise.
And I love that we've actually heard this from quite a few Metatrex listeners, that they didn't really know anything about philosophy before they started listening to Metatrex, and now I feel like they're getting a top-notch, first-class philosophy / Star Trek education here with us on Metatrex. So it really is satisfying to know we've brought philosophy to the proverbial masses.
Yes, and we do try to keep it fair and balanced, so Star Trek fans get plenty of Star Trek, and folks who are interested in learning more about philosophy can get a good, healthy dose of philosophy here on Metatrex. Well, Zachary, again, we're going to be talking about Star Trek Voyager Season 6. And as I said before, this is, in my opinion, I think one of the strongest seasons of Voyager. I know Voyager has always been a little bit more your thing than it has been mine, but this particular season of Voyager I've always felt was very strong. Some of my favorite episodes, not only of Voyager, but really some episodes that I think deserve to be in the ranks of best Star Trek episodes are in this season.
Yeah, for me, Season 6 of Star Trek Voyager is a season I come back to again and again. Probably Seasons 4, 5, and 6 together as a trifecta are my favorite seasons of Voyager, but Season 6 has some of my favorite Voyager episodes, and I came up with a surprisingly long list of episodes that we could talk about here today. I had to whittle it down to get it into the show.
You had to do what? You had to whittle?
I wonder where that came from.
That's an inside joke for you, To the Journey listeners, who are joining us here on Metatrex today.
Okay, what are your initial thoughts on season 6 of Voyager?
Yeah, I really like season 6. Like you said, there's some great episodes in here. Once I started looking through the list, it was tough. Yeah, it was really tough to try and pull this down to a shorter list because, yeah, I could have had 10 on here quite easily.
Yeah, and while there are certainly some episodes that I think are great episodes that aren't necessarily heavy on philosophy, there are actually quite a number of episodes in season 6 that I think have good philosophical content. I think it's going to be difficult for us to, as Zachary mentioned, whittle our list down, but I do have a list of 3 essentials, and I've got 3 honorable mentions as well. As Zachary and I, as we've done this in the past, we find that we overlap a little bit, and that's okay. If our lists overlap, there's nothing wrong with that at all. So for our listeners who aren't familiar, perhaps, with our Essential Trek philosophy, what we've done is we are taking each iteration of Star Trek, each series of Star Trek, and we're actually going in reverse order. So we've made our way to Star Trek Voyager Season 6, just coming off of Enterprise Season 3 last time, Zachary, and now we're on Star Trek Voyager Season 6, and we are looking for episodes that we consider to be Essential Trek philosophy, episodes that are strong in their philosophical content. And as we've said before, usually these lists end up being just whatever suits our fancy at the moment, as they say, because if we do this a year from now, we'd probably come up with an entirely different list of episodes. But here we are. We've got a list of essentials, and we're ready to deliver.
And we should say that unlike most of our Metatrex episodes, in which we try to dive into a particular topic or a particular episode in depth and really pick it apart with all of its nuances, when we do an episode of Essential Trek Philosophy, we are trying to cover the highlights of an entire season. So we're not planning to go into depth on any one of these topics. We just want to give you listeners a sense of what our picks are for the most philosophically rich episodes in an entire season. And then if you want to drill down and listen to us talk further about any of these topics or any of these episodes, you can probably find these topics and some of these episodes in previous episodes of Metatrex, and definitely down the road we'll be talking about these episodes in future episodes of Metatrex as well.
Indeed. Well, Kay, since you are the guest, we're going to give you the first pick.
Okay, right. Well, I'll have to decide which one I want to pick off my list then, because I hadn't really ranked them in order.
We should say that these are generally in no specific order. I know for both Zachary and myself, we don't typically put these in any particular order, so it doesn't matter. I know that we have some that'll be more honorable mention. We'll save those for a lightning round at the end of the podcast today.
Yeah, we don't want to be too logical or too structured here on Metatrex. We need a good dose of randomness and arbitrariness.
Okay, well, I'll go with the first one that I thought of then when you said Voyager Season 6 to me. And the first episode that came into my head was the episode Memorial, which is the episode where Chakotay, Tom, Harry, and Neelix go off on an away mission. And they come back and they start getting all these flashbacks of the fact that they've been in this war. And then, obviously, the crew go and investigate, and it all escalates from there. And they find this planet with this memorial that's all about this atrocity that happened a long time ago. So that's the first one that I chose, because it just really struck me that there were a lot of questions here. So there are a lot of questions about sort of how we learn from history and what lessons we should take from history, and also, you know, the various ethics around what the people who'd put the memorial there had done and things like that. So
Memorial was on my list as well, and the reason it showed up on my list was that for me it raises the issue of how much you have to experience someone else's suffering or someone else's pain or someone else's experiences to be able to really empathize, to have a genuine appreciation of what people went through. This episode really pushes the boundaries and kind of makes the claim that in order to really appreciate history or to appreciate previous people's suffering, you have to have the same experiences, and that's really traumatic for the Voyager crew. And I guess that for me, that's an interesting question. Do you have to have something on the level of, say, Counselor Troy type empathy to be able to really have an appreciation for the moral dilemmas and the suffering that other people have gone through?
I didn't have this one on my list, and as we talked in the Turbo Lift, Zachary, I purposely had a list of about 10 episodes, and I managed to pare mine down to 3, and I kept a few episodes off of the list that I thought might be strong contenders on your list. So in that, I was correct. I know my co-host. So I love this episode in that it deals with a lot of really interesting topics, a lot of interesting themes. First of all, I think the low-hanging fruit here is, PTSD, and we're dealing with the morality and with the ethics of war. And one of the things that I found really interesting about this episode is that at first, the Voyager crew doesn't realize that they are experiencing the memories of other people. At first, they really believe that they had somehow participated in this bloodbath, and they are wrestling with their own morality and their own set of ethics and trying to determine how it is that, their ethics and their morality could have been pushed aside so easily for them to have participated in this. And I found that really fascinating. It was kind of an interesting juxtaposition between, Starfleet principles and, say the ethics and morality of this alien culture during a time of war. And I thought that was really interesting.
Do you guys think that this episode is kind of making the claim that to argue about morality and ethics in the abstract is very different from being down on the ground in the proverbial trenches, that when you're in a particular situation, you might make judgment calls that strike you as heinous or unacceptable in the abstract?
I think that's a recurring theme sometimes in Star Trek, because we tend to visit these situations where Starfleet captains in particular are faced with making moral decisions that are contrary to their general nature. And so they are conflicted. And that conflict, in some cases, ends up leading them down a path that they wouldn't have necessarily seen themselves going down. And I know that's particularly true for Captain Archer. I know Catherine Janeway's faced with that quite a number of times over the run of Voyager, but she always kind of brings her crew back to this idea of Starfleet principles, which I think is pretty fascinating, considering that they are out there in the Delta Quadrant, sort of absent of both the comfort and the burden of Starfleet principles.
Okay, since this was first on your list, what do you think is the sort of key takeaway of this episode? Is there a fundamental message that we as viewers and listeners should get from Memorial?
Well, what I kind of took from it as a message was sort of what the aliens had actually done in creating the memorial there. I thought that was a big question. Is it right that they've chosen to inflict this on people for the purposes of potentially avoiding something like that happening again? People who've experienced it, as they said later on, I think it was Janeway said, well, I'm not going to forget what happened. Whereas if they just read about it, or if they just watched a holo vid or something like that, they probably wouldn't have remembered it in quite the way. And obviously that was the intention. So there was that, and also there was this question of, as you both mentioned, how we experience history. How, when we read about history, how do we actually relate to what happened? How well do we actually relate to what happened? And how much of it is something we can't really understand because we've not been through it?
I mean, this is like the ideal history textbook. Rather than just reading about history, it would be amazing to be able to relive historical moments, and that's what's going on in this episode. It's a little harsh to force these horrific experiences on the Voyager crew. On the other hand, the memorial is actually malfunctioning. And this idea that these experiences are being forced on the Voyager crew as a result of the malfunctioning of the memorial. But presumably the memorial is not supposed to function like that. You're supposed to volunteer or hit the magic button to be able to experience these experiences. So I think on the surface it raises this issue of maybe using the Voyager crew against their will for some purpose, of some historical memorial purpose. But that's purely a function of the malfunctioning memorial, I think.
The thing I find rather fascinating about this, and it really doesn't lend itself so much to a philosophical conversation, is the fact that this memorial in this particular form in the episode exists. And I think it's very plausible that in the future that we have these types of memorials and museums. I mean, after all, we've been creating memorials for various events throughout history for eons. And I know here in the United States, and I know it's true in Great Britain where you're at, Kay, that these memorials, they're put up, and sometimes they're life-size statues and, various monuments with names etched on them. Here in the United States, we have a memorial to the fallen in Vietnam. It's a massive wall, and we have a miniature that travels all around the country. Here in Dallas, where I live, the book depository where Lee Harvey Oswald presumably shot John F. Kennedy is now a museum. In Oklahoma City, just up the road from me, there is a memorial to the Oklahoma City bombing in which they play an audio track in that memorial that simulates the audible sounds that were heard from that place as that bomb was detonated there at the Federal Building. And so it seems to me that memorials have come a long way from, a stone with something etched on it to massive walls with names imprinted on it to life-size statues, and then we're going into these interactive experiences. I think it's really fascinating, and I don't think it's so outside of plausibility to think that at some point in time there could possibly be some type of memorial that would allow a person to relive, in essence, a historical event.
It's interesting to me how this multimedia or more experiential element to history in general has shaped our perception of historical events. I remember back in the 90s, about when this episode was airing, that multimedia encyclopedias, like a multimedia version of the Encyclopedia Britannica, was all the rage. And the idea was you don't just have to read about history in some boring book. You don't just have to look at a stone monument. You can actually experience something visual, some audio-visual treatment of the event, to kind of immerse yourself in in historical events more directly. And so this is like the logical extension of that step, right? This is like the holographic / mind control version of an Encyclopedia Britannica or Encyclopedia Galactica. So I guess my question is, what does that change our perception of history? Do we relate to history in a stronger way or in a more immersive way? Do we draw different conclusions about history based on this experiential or multimedia perception of history? Or, like always, do people find history a little boring? I think, when I was when I was in high school, even though I had an interactive Encyclopedia Britannica, I didn't find history all that interesting. I'm curious whether this really does help people appreciate history more than in the past.
I was just going to say, I found history really boring when I was at school, so I can totally relate to that. And I remember those Britannica.
So if you had a mind control memorial, you would have been all over
I think. Well, it depends how traumatic it was. I'm not sure I'd want it to be quite this traumatic, but.
Well, next time you're exhibiting symptoms of PTSD, I'll know where to start looking for the cause.
Check that Encyclopedia Britannica disc.
Well, I think, Kay, you hit the nail on the head. For me, I've always enjoyed history. History's always been something that I have really had an interest in, and I think the point here, either you or Zachary one had made the point that they were being forced, that the Voyager crew was being forced to relive this, and the ethical question in essence is, should somebody be forced to live? Let's take it out of the Voyager universe and let's go to the Inner Light from Star Trek: The Next Generation, in which Captain Picard was really violated by an alien probe that caused him to live a lifetime in an alien culture. And again, we romanticize about history much the same way we can watch The Inner Light and kind of romanticize about the life that he lived. And I get sentimental when I watch him play the flute, and it makes me think of how we oftentimes view history now. We romanticize about it. World War II, we call that generation the greatest generation. We've romanticized to some degree about something really horrific, and that is a global war. And so I think it's easy for us to romanticize about history when we're not experiencing it. But as the Voyager crew found out, this wasn't something to romanticize about. This was something that traumatized them. And, perhaps, the EMH had to upgrade his programming to include counseling after this event.
Do you think this episode would have made a stronger impression if Harry Kim had played his clarinet in the episode?
Only if he was playing that beautiful melody that Captain Picard was.
Yeah.
Or Echoes from the Void. The inner void. That could be the alternate title of this episode, The Inner Void.
The Inner Void.
Yeah. He goes into that cave, he shoots those people, and then he sits down and plays his
pulls
little
his clarinet
sad song.
out.
Yeah.
Little requiem music or a funeral dirge on his clarinet.
Yeah. Maybe the whole thing would have been vastly more pleasant if that had happened.
Tom sits down and starts watching cartoons.
Yeah.
Nice.
I don't really feel like them experiencing this particular event, if you like, would have changed their perception about it in terms of their opinion of what went on compared to reading about it. But it certainly meant they wouldn't forget about it. And the idea was to sort of honour those people, wasn't it, that had been massacred. It wasn't just any historical event. It was a particular atrocity that they wanted to make sure people didn't forget about. So I'm not sure how I feel. I thought it was quite interesting. We actually got a little philosophical debate in the episode. They were all there, sort of, in the conference room there, just having a little chat about, well, it's not right. We should have had to experience this. And then Neelix is the one that's pushing, going, well, no, we can't let them forget.
Yeah.
And then Janeway comes in and she's like, no, can't let people forget about it. So I'm glad we actually even saw them having that debate, not just that the debate was presented for us through the story.
And they reach a pretty good middle ground by the end of it. They repair the device, but they put a warning buoy in orbit, and so other people will know what to expect when they show up in orbit. Well,
that's an interesting question in and of itself. When you have a tragic event in history, how important is it that we preserve and remember that event? I think that in and of itself is an interesting question. And again, oftentimes history gets told through the perspective of the victors. And so again, we romanticize about these things that were certainly traumatic for the people who were experiencing them. But I think that's a rather fascinating question. Just to what degree should we memorialize and remember?
It speaks to the fundamental question of the purpose of history. Is the purpose of history to honor the people that came before? Is the purpose of history to not forget the lessons so the same things don't happen again? Do we have an obligation, some sort of moral obligation to the future to preserve our history for people down the road? So it does seem to get to, in my mind, to the heart of the fundamental question of what is the purpose of history and what's our obligation in response to it.
So Zachary, I know Memorial was on your list, but what's your first official pick for Season 6 of Star Trek Voyager?
Okay, so the first pick of mine is Dragon's Teeth, which is actually one of my favorite episodes of Star Trek in general. And I know a lot of people don't like Dragon's Teeth, and I think if you really pick apart the story, there are some problems with the story. If you remember, the crew of Voyager finds this race of people, the Vaadwaur, that have been in stasis for some number of centuries, and there's been what's essentially a post-apocalyptic scenario, and they've annihilated themselves in wars. And another race, the Terrae, have taken control of the interspatial corridors that have previously allowed the Vaadwaur to travel quickly between solar systems and different regions of the galaxy and whatnot. It's interesting that we're talking about this episode, Dragon's Teeth, after talking about Memorial, because in my mind, a similar issue is raised. We get to see history from a certain perspective inside Dragon's Teeth, and we get to weigh these two perspectives, the perspective of the Terrae versus the perspective of the Vaadwaur. And at a certain point in the episode, Captain Janeway has to come to the Vaadwaur and say, hey, I've heard a different version of this history you've told me, and you guys look more like conquerors than explorers. And so in my mind, it just speaks to this hermeneutical question about the nature of history, that anytime you're looking back at historical events, you've got competing interpretations, competing perspectives. And in some sense, they're all true. The Vaudois were conquerors, and they were also explorers. And the Terrais, they're now the victors of this war that left the Vaudois essentially conquered. But they're opportunists as well, and there are these competing interpretations of historical events. And I think that's just a fundamental truth about studying history, that you never just study pure uninterpreted facts. You get history from certain perspectives. And then the challenge is to weigh these perspectives against each other, put yourselves in the shoes of everyone related to the scenario, pick apart different competing causes and interpretations. And history is much more of a complex web of interpretations than just simple facts. And I think that's true of Memorial as well. When we are experiencing the experiences that we talked about in Memorial, these PTSD type of experiences, you're getting history from that perspective. It would be interesting to ask, well, was there another perspective on those same events? If the other side had a memorial as well, would they create a different type of memorial? Would they have a different interpretation, different set of experiences that were relevant to those events? And I think Dragon's Teeth is just a natural segue into the concepts that were introduced there in Memorial.
Okay, was Dragon's Teeth on your list?
It wasn't. It was on my longer list, but it wasn't on my short list.
Okay. One of the smaller points about Dragon's Teeth that I found really interesting, and it kind of lends itself to this, idea of the philosophy and development of language, is that the point that Neelix made, that in the old Talaxian dialect, Vaudois actually was a word that meant fool. And I thought that was really interesting. It's a very minor point in the episode, but I found it really fascinating that here is an instance in which we get to see how the actions and reactions of this alien species actually made its way into the popular dialect of another alien species. I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, there's kind of a philology inside this episode, right? That the meaning of the word Vaudois is directly relevant to the interpretations of the historical events, and they influence each other. That unless you have that nuanced understanding of the words at play, you might not I want to say the true meaning, but these alternative interpretations of historical events, the Vaudois being not the superior race necessarily, not the intelligent, peaceful explorers, but the foolish conquerors that allowed their homeworld to be destroyed. If you didn't have that shade of meaning inside the word Vaudois, the truth of the historical events might not have come to light. So you can kind of and I think there's just something to this, that you can pick apart historical events by looking for the threads that they leave in our language. I mean, you can take a language like English. We've got threads from Latin, we've got threads from Greek, we've got threads from Italian, threads from French. Mm-hmm. There's this history of this tapestry of different shades of meaning, and that's how we communicate. And if you don't have that rich understanding of the words at play, you can miss some of the important concepts that those words are supposed to refer to.
I thought it was kind of fascinating. I referred to my Cardassian dictionary, and I actually discovered that Vaudois in Cardassian means good looking, i.e. sexy.
I love that first of all, I love that you have a Cardassian dictionary.
Yes.
And second of all, is that actually true? Are you making this up? Is this
totally
for real?
Making it up, just for the simple fact that the Vaudois I thought were very Cardassian-ish.
Cardassian-like,
yes,
right?
They were very Cardassian-like. So I thought it might be fun to speculate that Vaudois perhaps means good-looking or sexy in Cardassian.
Mike, it's funny that you mentioned that, because now I'm kind of picturing this alternate scene inside the movie where Gedrin, the leader of the Vaudois, is standing there inside one of the rooms on Voyager, and he says, "You'll forgive me, Captain Janeway, but this was my office only 600 years ago."
Brilliant, I love it. Yeah, I really like this episode. Like you say, it raises some really interesting questions about how, as an outsider coming into something and seeing two conflicting points of view, how is it that you decide or figure out what's actually gone on? It's quite an interesting one.
And there's something in my mind just so amazing about this idea of resurrecting a dead culture, a culture that's long destroyed. Imagine if you could do that here on Earth, if you could resurrect, an ancient Greek society or an ancient Roman society or a Babylonian society. I mean, and that's essentially what happens in this episode. You've got a society that's been conquered. Their race is largely eliminated. It's a post-apocalyptic environment on their home planet, and out of the ground springs new life. The Vodwar get resurrected and get thrown into the present. It would be fascinating to be able to bring people from the past into today's world and see what they identify with and what they don't. And I always had this suspicion, like if you brought like an ancient Roman to our society, they would recognize a lot of things. They'd know roads, they'd know plumbing, mm-hmm. they'd know communication methods, and it would be there's new technology, but I think they would find it largely familiar. And I would love to see. And we get to see something like that inside this episode. The Vodwar get thrown into the present. There's a lot that they recognize. They're in the middle of this conflict with the Turay again. There's weapons. It's basically the same situation. They need to conquer the ship, and they're going to become conquerors, and they don't actually change who they are, even though they're brought out of time.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point of view as well, that they learn nothing from their experience. They're all too anxious to just kind of jump in and pick up where they left off, and I thought that was kind of fascinating.
Can you blame them though, really? I mean, their race is essentially conquered. Now they have a new chance to become dominant again by taking over Voyager. I would probably do the same thing in their situation, in all honesty.
Yeah, I mean, I really don't know. I don't know what I would do. And you said, well, what if we resurrected the Roman society or the Greek society or what have you? I don't know the answer to that question, but I would hope that one would learn from their past experiences and try to acclimate before they just kind of pick up where they left off and okay, we're going to get back in the business of trying to conquer our enemies and rule the galaxy.
So I really think that if you resurrected Julius Caesar, he would immediately be plotting how to march back into Rome.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting what you say, because I think almost the reason they haven't learned is because they stopped at a point and then they've just been, for them, no time has passed. Mm-hmm. And almost the learning from history and the change in society, it doesn't happen like that, does it? It's almost overnight for them, and it's, even though we can see that all this time has passed, but maybe if they hadn't have been in stasis, one would have hoped they would have moved on by now.
All right. Well, my first choice is Blink of an Eye. It is the 12th episode of season 6, and I have to say that this episode, in my opinion, really packs it in. It really packs it in. We just had a conversation, Zachary, in episode 54 of Metatrex entitled The Nennebec Paradox, where we discussed paradoxes of motion. I think some of those themes are in here. We're dealing with issues of time passage, the passage of time, science versus religion. I mean, this episode really packs a lot in, as Voyager is trapped, in essence, above a planet in which time moves much more quickly for them below than it does on Voyager, and Voyager becomes part of their mythos, part of their society's legend. They become worship, the sky people up there in the sky, and then that evolution into actually realizing that, hey, that ship up there is what's causing the problems down here. As science begins to evolve, then they're firing nukes at them. So I think this really packs it in terms of content. There's really too much to talk about almost in this episode.
So Prime Directive aside, I find this an incredibly romantic episode. This idea that Voyager has not just become, not just affected their society, but has become sort of foundational to the society. It's spawned art, it spawned religion, it spawned creativity, it spawned self-identity in these people. And so just the ability to make an impact on an entire world in that way. Again, Prime Directive aside, because, Captain Janeway, of course, is violating the Prime Directive in being there. They have had this effect that they shouldn't have had. So Blink of an Eye was actually on my list as well, but I put it on my list for a very specific reason. I think the sort of anthropological perspective that this episode takes is that there's a natural cultural progression from, this Bronze Age into an industrial age, into a futuristic technological society, and that and I think this is a theme that runs throughout Star Trek, that Star Trek seems to take the perspective that left to their own devices, different races will go through a very similar cultural progression, ending up with something higher level and evolved and morally superior along the lines of a Federation society that's tolerant and nonviolent and definitely is laden with these idealistic human values. And I think this episode just lays it all bare and says, when this planet is first encountered, they're at a certain point in development that's analogous to some point in Earth's development and in centuries past, and they watch all of human history unfold on this planet, and the development parallels our development almost exactly. So, and I think this is just Star Trek's perspective on cultural evolution, that despite the diversity that you see in Star Trek, there's definitely a single trajectory that these different planets and these different races go through. And for better or worse, I think Star Trek makes the claim that left to their own devices, eventually societies will progress and evolve towards, as Spock put it in Unification. Spock basically said there's this inevitable progression towards the ideals of Vulcan philosophy. And that seems to be what's going on in this episode, that this race is progressing to be more enlightened. And of course, Voyager, it's interesting. You can kind of pick it apart and ask, is Voyager the cause of that, or is Voyager watching a natural progression given that they've already affected the planet? But it's definitely a very sort of long. It's funny we're talking about so much about history inside this discussion on essential Trek philosophy. So many of our themes seem to be related to the interpretations and the perspective of history. But in this episode, we get to see history unfold over the centuries, literally in the blink of an eye.
Yeah, it struck me. Well, it's always struck me watching this episode how closely the history of this planet mirrors human history. I find that interesting. I'm guessing that's sort of it's a writer's thing, isn't it? That's the model that they have to sort of reflect on, and how easy would it be to write a whole separate, different idea of history completely for one episode. But I think
it seems like every race that's encountered inside Star Trek that's sort of pre-warp society is kind of like this. They're either pre-industrialist, or they're violent, or they've got some sort of political structure that we consider to be antiquated. But this comes up again and again and again inside Star Trek.
Yeah, the bit that struck me about it the most was the bit where they have these monks. There's these monks in the monk robes, and then they've got this castle, and it's just like, that could just quite easily have been a photo from somewhere straight off Earth at that time, sort of thing. Straight out
of England.
Yeah, we have a lot of castles. Yeah, we do.
I really appreciated the way that they dealt, and I know Voyager kind of gets a bad rap sometimes for the technobabble and the bad science, and I really, for the most part, I kind of push back against that, because the technobabble doesn't bother me. And really, a science fiction show, you're not always going to get what we consider conventional science. It's going to push the boundaries, and I think Voyager always did a really good job of that. But I really appreciate how they dealt with the differences in the passage of time and the science, in this episode, how it was presented and how it was dealt with in the episode. I thought that was really well done.
Even though they saved the day at the end with some kind of temporal compensator.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you have to have some kind of trope to make it all right at the end, but I think for the most part, they really did a good job with the science and how they presented the problem in this episode from a scientific perspective.
Yeah. I agree with you, what you said at the beginning when we started talking about this one, Mike, which is that there's so much in here, it's almost difficult to talk about it because you could go down any number of different paths. But one of the things that really struck me about this episode was this idea that, Daniel Day Kim, I forget his character name, but he comes up and sort of meets his gods, if you like. He sort of meets them, and I like that little scene he has with Janeway where she's like, "Oh, I hope you're not disappointed." And I just thought there was some really interesting questions there about about how that is for someone to actually meet this thing and realize what something is that they've had their own interpretation of for a really long time.
And this is a really interesting role reversal for Star Trek, because usually when you encounter something that's godlike in Star Trek, when you unmask it, it ends up being devious or ends up being immoral in some way. And in this case, when Voyager, the crew of the Voyager as gods are sort of unmasked, they are just, relatable, normal people. They're not gods, but they're not devious. They're not trying to harm the planet. It's a pretty gentle god unmasking for Star Trek.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that there's a really good kind of science versus religion sort of conversation that takes place throughout this episode. At the beginning of the episode, when the Sky People first appear up there, they're revered and they become really foundational in terms of, the religion of the planet. They become ingrained into the mythos to the point that, talk about, your Star Trek toys. I mean, they had Sky People action figures and so on and so.
Yeah.
Tickle Me Worth Nothing. They had a Tickle Me Janeway.
And I've mentioned this before on Metatrex, but some listeners may remember that I'm also a ham radio operator amongst the many other things I do. And I love kind of the space ham radio that happens here. The guy grabs the microphone and tries to talk to the sky ship over the radio waves.
Yes.
It's amazing.
Yeah, and so there's really a wonderful conversation, I think, that happens inside this episode, to the point that, the inhabitants of this planet below evolved to the point scientifically that they sort of figure it all out. And now this isn't their god up in the sky. This is a foreign object that needs to be eliminated before it tears the planet apart. And I really thought it was interesting how they handled that throughout this episode. I thought it was sort of unique to Star Trek. You referred to it, Zachary, as kind of a benign unmasking of the gods. But I thought it was interesting the way they handled that in the episode.
And because of the time differential, I love that we get to see the moment in time in which the aliens kind of move forward technologically past where Voyager is. They at the end of the episode, they show up and they've got the technology with the temporal compensator, and they've figured out the whole situation. Mm-hmm. They know how to help Voyager get out, because that's the logical extension, right? If their time is progressing more rapidly than on Voyager, at a certain point, their development is going to lap ahead of where Voyager's at technologically.
Yeah, yeah. And that was a great conclusion to the episode too, I think.
I was just going to say it's nice that you get an episode that feels like such a complete story, because so many episodes you just get a sort of snapshot of something that happened in a very short window of time, and it almost feels like you've watched an epic.
Yeah. And you mentioned Daniel Day Kim.
Mm-hmm.
I love him. I love his acting. I'm a big fan, and I really think that he was the icing on the cake, as they say, in this episode. I don't think any other actor could have pulled that role off in such a endearing way.
There's only one actor that comes to mind: Jeffrey Combs could have pulled that off. He's the only other one.
The only other one. The only other one that could have outshined Daniel Day Kim.
He was on that planet somewhere. He was down there somewhere. He was probably the Doctor's son. That was probably Jeffrey Combs.
Well, that's another interesting theme about this, and I'm almost sorry that we didn't revisit, because the Doctor lived an entire, span of his lifetime down there as an inhabitant of this planet. He had a family, he had an apartment, a life, he was a sports fan, and I honestly wish we could have had a little bit more of this episode and explored
Did he bring a flute back to Voyager as a souvenir, or maybe a CD of some, alien opera music?
He brought a pretty cool outfit. I liked his outfit.
And I love that the Doctor seems genuinely moved. Like, he had, a relationship, and he had someone he considered to be his son. All this happens in a blink of an eye for Voyager, so they can't relate. But he's lived years on this planet, and has really become involved. And he didn't isolate himself and try to avoid cultural contamination. He really lived the life of someone on this planet.
I think rather than pulling out a flute or a clarinet or even singing opera, I think the Doctor spent the next several months replicating mountain sports memorabilia for his
Definitely.
office.
I can imagine him with a little bobblehead of What
were the teams? Lakeside and Mountain?
Yes, it was Mountain and Lakeside. And of course, He had a bobblehead of the Torellius.
Yes.
So that is blink of an eye. So up to this point, we have Kay with Memorial. Zachary, your first choice was Dragon's Teeth. I had blink of an eye. And of course, I should mention that Memorial and blink of an eye were also on your list, Zachary. So you're going to have to go to your reserve list after Kay gives her next pick.
Okay, well, blink of an eye was on my list as well, so we all went with that one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I think my next pick, I've got Ashes to Ashes. So Ashes to Ashes, just to give a quick recap, is the episode where they get this alien woman show up, and she sort of seems to know who they all are, and it turns out that she is the sort of resurrected crewman that they lost quite some years earlier, Lindsay Ballard.
Mm-hmm.
So we get this sort of interesting story about how she's been found by this alien race, and this is how they reproduce by taking the bodies of other races and resurrecting them with their whatever magical biology technology they've got. And we get this sort of interesting idea of her wanting to come back to Voyager, and then all the morality around it, and sort of, you know, eventually she ends up going back with them. But I found there were some really, really interesting questions here about sort of this idea that they've finished with her is kind of what the race that pick her up, sort of that's their theory behind it. It's like, oh, well, you just disposed of her, and they don't really understand about this idea of, like, obviously human and I'm guessing other races in the Federation as well have this reverence around, you know, they're dead. And they don't see it that way. They see it as, well, you got rid of her, and now we're gonna do whatever. And that I found really fascinating. There's a lot of questions there about what is the body after you've died and things like that. There's a lot of questions there.
So Ashes to Ashes made my list of alternates, my honorable mentions. It wasn't on my main list. But for me, the main issue that I identified in Ashes to Ashes is a personal identity issue. Mm-hmm. For me, I don't think it's obvious at all that it's actually Lindsay Ballard that's come back to the ship. She has a different physiology. Her genome's been altered. Her personality is different. There's so many things about her that have changed. And yes, she might have some of the original Lindsay Ballard's memories, but it's not obvious at all to me that it's actually the same individual that's come back, as opposed to a substantively distinct individual that happens to have some of Lindsay Ballard's memories.
Yeah, I agree, Zachary. This was on my main list for that exact reason, this idea of personal identity. Really what we're looking at is a humanoid ship of Theseus. I think it's kind of, you know, she went out into a torpedo. She was Lindsay Ballard. She was deceased, and she's not just Lindsay Ballard reanimated any longer. They have changed her physiology. They have fundamentally changed her. And so the question, I think the big question that they are asking and trying to answer in this episode is she still Lindsay Ballard?
And in the course of our lives, we all change. We all accumulate new memories. Some of our preferences come and go. But this is a pretty radical change. Her DNA's been altered. Her physiology's been altered. Her personality's been altered. So much so that you have to ask this. It's kind of a line drawing problem. Has enough change taken place where she's on the other side of that line and she's a distinct individual now? Or is she just a heavily modified Lindsay Ballard?
And I think, to speak to your point too, Kay, and I think you raised a really good one, this idea of how this alien culture views death. This is really something I think that's very unique for Star Trek, in that this alien culture, they don't procreate like we do. They're very different. Their procreation process is kind of a reclaiming of alien bodies, and they take them and they rewire them, so to speak. They change their genome. They do a little gene splicing, and, you know, bam, they have a whole new person to join, and they're taken into a family, and they're assimilated into the culture. And I thought that was really fascinating. Not only, as you said, how they view death. Well, you discarded her. You know, that's how they kind of justified it. Well, you discarded her. But this is what they do. They go out and they search for dead bodies, and
they're like environmentalists. They don't throw anything away. They recycle everything.
Waste not, want not.
Eco-conscious.
Yeah.
Reclaim, reuse.
Yeah, I mean, I think the two points, both the one that I mentioned and the one that you guys brought up, I think they link together quite nicely, because it's almost as if you answer the one question, you answer the other question. Because if you decide, well, no, she's not Lindsay Ballard, then you're like, well, yeah, she is just a dead body, and they can just transform her into whatever they choose. But then if you decide that somehow she is still her, then it's not okay. It's almost like I feel like they're intrinsically linked.
Yeah, I think somewhere in a writer's room, though, they definitely toyed with alternative titles for this episode, and I'm pretty sure that Recycle, Reclaim, and Reuse was one of them. So, yes, this was on my list as well. It looks like it made it to all of our lists, ashes to ashes.
The only thing that's missing from that episode is the Doctor having a mental breakdown because he doesn't even remember who Lindsay Ballard is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it would have been nice, I think, to tie it in with something that had happened earlier on. I think that's the one thing that's missing. And I almost feel like sometimes some things that I've heard people say, that's something that almost makes people write this episode off before they've given it a chance, because they're like, well, we've no idea who she is, so we don't care.
Yeah.
It's like, well, yeah, but that's not really the point of the episode, so...
I was actually really amazed at the extent to which I could kind of retcon her into Voyager history, right?
Yeah.
She's such a compelling character. It's very easy for me to just imagine she was there all along.
Yeah, I'm the same way. Although I think the relationship with Harry Kim was a little over the top. I mean, let's face it. You know, Harry doesn't have good luck with the girls, so I thought that was just a little unbelievable in the episode.
I don't know. He's got all the moves. He busts out the clarinet, plays a song. He's smoother than he gets credit for.
But something I will say about this episode, this is one of those episodes I really could have stood for this to be a two-parter, because I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of her struggle and coming to terms with, you know, I'm not Lindsay Ballard anymore. Again, you're trying to squeeze this into, you know, what, 40, 48 minutes, 45 minutes, 42 minutes, whatever the case may be. And so I feel like that progression was a little rushed. But I also feel that there's almost an interesting juxtaposition here between Ashes to Ashes and, say, Tuvix. Almost another way of looking at it. Maybe a little redemption too for Voyager on that Tuvix problem.
Yeah.
Well, just like in Tuvix, you have to ask the fundamental question: have Tuvok's and Neelix's fundamental rights been violated insofar as they're essentially gone and have been replaced by this new being, Tuvix? Mm-hmm. We can ask that a similar question about Lindsay Ballard.
Yes, absolutely.
Have her rights been violated insofar as, you know, the original Lindsay Ballard is to some extent dead and gone, and she's been brought back to life and heavily modified. She's been destroyed. I mean, she still thinks of herself as Lindsay Ballard, and that's what's a little strange about this. Unlike Tuvix, who doesn't think of himself as Tuvok and doesn't think of himself as Neelix, he's a distinct individual. I don't think it's as obvious in the case of the new Lindsay Ballard that she is so different that she doesn't identify with the original Lindsay Ballard anymore. She basically says, "I'm Lindsay Ballard," right? So she at least recognizes her own connection to her previous state of existence. But in bringing her back to life and modifying her like is done, you know, have the rights of the original Lindsay Ballard been violated, a la Tuvok and Neelix and Tuvix?
Yeah, and you know they take on that question, but not to a great degree. Again, I think the overall theme of the episode is really this idea of personal identity. Is she still Lindsay Ballard, or rather, is she at all Lindsay Ballard any longer? And
well, she still has late night cravings for Leola root stew, so in that sense, she's still Lindsay Ballard. She's brought a little bit of Voyager, a little taste of Voyager with her to her new
although
life.
It's no longer palatable. So
yeah, because it tasted amazing beforehand.
Yeah. So, Kay, that was a great pick. Ashes to Ashes. Zachary, what's next on your list?
Okay, so next on my list is the Voyager conspiracy. So if you remember in the Voyager conspiracy, 7 of 9 is inventing conspiracy theory after conspiracy theory after she's downloaded too much information and her brain is and her Borg systems are struggling to process all this information and make coherent sense of it. And the reason I put this on my list is it strikes me as really related to the bad reasoning that people who are proponents of conspiracy theories in general put forward. Generally, with conspiracy theories, you get these ad hoc modifications to the theory and attempt to save the conspiracy theory. Like if you really believe that the moon landings, for example, were a hoax, then no matter what evidence you're presented with, you can twist and bend your conspiracy theory to try to save that theory and dismiss any new evidence. And it almost doesn't matter whether you have to modify your own conspiracy theory. What matters is not accepting the new evidence if you're a conspiracy theorist. So this kind of ad hoc modification to your conspiracy theory, to hold on to that conspiracy theory no matter what, is something I've seen again and again and again in people who are proponents of these really generally unaccepted conspiracy theories, whether it's something having to do with the assassination of JFK, or whether it's the moon landings, or pick your favorite conspiracy theory. People who are proponents will tend to hold on to that conspiracy theory almost no matter what new evidence they're presented with.
This was actually one of my honorable mentions, and I think that there is a hermeneutical aspect to it, but I feel like it's dealing primarily with the philosophy of logical interpretation, judicial interpretation. I think that there's a lot of that kind of in there, especially judicial interpretation, in that, the idea behind judicial interpretation is, how do we interpret, especially when you're dealing with things like the Constitution, a historical document, how do we interpret that? What did it mean? What was the original intent of, say, the founding fathers when they wrote the Constitution, or whatever, the Magna Carta, or whatever the idea may be? In the courtroom, it's how do you interpret the law? How do you interpret the precedents that you're citing in a case? And so I feel like that this was a heavy theme inside the episode, because she is pulling in all of this data and trying to interpret it. She's trying to make sense of it, and unfortunately, it's too much. And so as she's trying to put it together neatly, it's creating these. She's inventing these conspiracy theories because it doesn't seem to fit together neatly. She's trying to make order out of chaos.
I love that you use the example of judicial interpretation, because often I think that's what happens inside of a legal battle or inside a courtroom scenario. Oftentimes the two sides can actually stipulate to the actual facts at hand, but what matters is the competing interpretation of those facts. And inside the episode, Captain Janeway and Commander Chakotay almost come to blows, and at the end of that they realize that they've been presented with two very different interpretations of the very same set of facts. And it's not just a question of the facts speaking for themselves at that point. It's a question of how do you interpret those facts and weave them together into a coherent pattern. And there's always more than one coherent pattern you can get from any set of facts.
Indeed.
Yeah, this what you were saying there, Zach, about how people who have conspiracy theories in general really just reminded me of something that my dad always tends to say about things like that, which is, do not confuse me with the truth, my mind is made up.
Well, now we're living in the 21st century when we have alternative facts. So.
Yes.
Just become part of the vocabulary within the past week. So
I was going to say that's nice and topical.
So did Voyager conspiracy make your list at all, Kay?
I had it on my honorable mentions. It wasn't on my list.
I love that Captain Janeway essentially tells 7 of 9, you've got a list of alternative facts.
Yes.
Well, there you have it. In addition to the iPad, the cell phone, Star Trek invented alternative facts, listeners.
Yeah, it's not a new idea.
Not a new idea. Yeah.
7 of 9 for press secretary.
So in that, I had Ashes to Ashes, Blink of an Eye. I'm actually on my last Essentials pick, at least from my main list, and that episode is Child's Play, episode 19 of season 6. I really love this episode, guys, and shout out to our friend Manu. This was a Manu episode, and we actually, Zachary, got to have a bit of a conversation with him about the ethical dilemma in this episode, and we didn't really talk a lot about it, but I said then, and I'll say now, one of the things that I really appreciate about this is kind of the ethical implication of both genetic engineering and weaponizing people. I think this deals with one of the prevailing themes that you find throughout Voyager, as opposed to any other Star Trek. Voyager deals with this idea of individualism versus collectivism, and I don't think there is a better episode than this particular episode in dealing with that topic. So there was a lot of really interesting things going on here, but primarily they're taking a child and they're weaponizing him and they're using him. In fact, Seven makes the observation that it's not right for his parents to put their needs ahead of the safety of their child. And she kind of calls him out on it.
Yeah, I think if you run the ethical dilemma in this episode through just straight up Kantian reasoning, this definitely doesn't meet the criteria of not using people as a means to your own end and treating people with respect for their autonomy and whatnot. Basically, Icheb just gets used for someone else's ends and someone else's purposes inside this episode. And I think just, while that's not the only moral theory, I think that's a pretty plausible barometer that you can use to gauge our relationship with other people. Are you treating people with respect? Or are you using them as a means to your own ends, or are you treating them with autonomy? And I think this doesn't meet the bar at all of Kantian ethics in this episode.
Yeah, 7 of 9 says specifically, anyone who values their own goals over the safety of their children is irresponsible. And of course, Janeway says, hey, are we talking about his parents or are we talking about yours? And I think this was part of her struggle, because she sees a bit of herself, I think, in Icheb. But this, for me, is really not palatable when I think about his parents really against his will. At least that's the way it's presented. But at the end of the episode, he almost feels as though he owes them an apology, because he could have taken out that Borg sphere and saved those people.
This is a fascinating little microcosm of an ethical dilemma that you can look at from any number of different ethical theories. From the Kantian standpoint, these actions are wrong because they're not respecting Icheb's autonomy. If you looked at this from the perspective of virtue ethics, you can plausibly say that Icheb's parents are not acting as virtuous parents, right? There's something wrong with their relationship between themselves and their child in terms of care and responsibility and whatnot. You could look at this from the perspective of utilitarianism or consequentialism, that in turning Icheb into what's essentially a super weapon, they can prevent harm to a great many other people by helping to stop the Borg. And so you can argue the other side of the coin from a consequentialist standpoint and argue that they're doing something justifiable because they're trying to prevent greater harm than the harm to a single individual. So this would be a fun episode to really get down in the weeds and pick apart these different ethical nuances and different ethical theories, all focused on the same, fairly well-defined ethical dilemma.
Yeah. He definitely could have used his cool arm cannon for this one.
That was part of what his parents did, right? they gave him Uncle Manu's cool arm cannon.
Yeah, this came quite close to getting on my list for, all of the reasons that you said. I think it raises some really interesting questions about not anything quite as extreme as this, but certainly about things that have sort of come up in terms of, genetic ethics and things over the last 10, 15 years. So the thing that it reminded me of was this debate where people have a child, the child might have some kind of genetic problem, and then they end up having a second child, and and they somehow engineer the second child so that they can help to treat the problem that the first child has. And this almost reminded me of that, and got me thinking a little bit about the ethics of that and whether that was some sort of that type of thing maybe was very topical at the time when this episode was written. Maybe that was the first time this was coming up, and I wondered whether there was some sort of parallel there.
Yeah, that's a great thought. One of the things that I thought was really fascinating about how they played this. When he first goes and he meets his family, there's a group of boys. They're playing something that, perhaps resembles rugby or American football. And I really appreciate how they kind of took him, and he's playing. He's blending in. He's just one of the kids, and I think that's where we get the whole title, Child's Play. But what is going on in the peripheral with his parents is something, very, almost, it seems very sinister, and it's very adult in comparison to seeing him out there as a boy. And I think that was an interesting contrast, and they really showed him as a boy to, I think, accentuate just, how unethical this thing his parents were doing to him really was. All right, Kay, I believe you have one more on your list. Do you want to share it?
Yeah, so the other one that I had on my list was the episode Survival Instinct. So this is the episode where they sort of dock at this space station. Voyager docks at this space station. And they end up running into some people who turn out to be members of Seven's former Unimatrix. And there's this whole interesting backstory where we had this incident where they'd got separated from the collective for a short time some years before, and Seven had been the one who'd actually initiated them all going back and prevented them from sort of wandering off and becoming individuals. And now it turns out that these people, because of the surgery that they've had to separate them, has not been very successful. That they basically have the choice of either going back to the collective and surviving, or separating from the collective permanently, although they won't be able to survive for longer than, I think it was like a couple of months or something. And I felt like there were some really, really interesting questions in this episode. One is one that sort of Seven almost brings up herself, which is this idea that survival isn't sufficient. And what is it that got me thinking? What is it about life that makes life worth living? What is it? If survival's not sufficient and just surviving isn't what it's all about, what is it all about? What makes a life worth it? So that was the big question, and then there were some smaller questions as well around the idea of what is family, because Seven starts getting this idea of family, and she talks to Naomi about whether she thinks of her as family and all this type of thing. So I thought there was some quite interesting questions there that links into the idea of Voyager as a family as a whole, and what is it that makes family? If it's not blood, and it doesn't have to be, what is it? What makes that?
Kay, do you think that this episode presents an argument for individualism or for collectivism? I think it could go either way. It could be conceived as an argument for individualism, because clearly these former Borg have lost something insofar as they're not able to become fully autonomous individuals. So from the perspective of individualism, they're really lacking, and they're not able to become fully authentic beings like they once were. On the other hand, you could interpret the episode, I think, as saying that, look, they can't survive on their own. They're stronger as a unit together, so it's better for them to remain as a unit. So, insofar as part of the dialogue that we're in this 21st century is this dialogue between individualism and collectivism, which take do you think this episode, which angle do you think this episode takes on that topic?
I think it plays through the episode more towards the collectivism, but at the end, I feel like at the very end scene, I feel like the idea of them becoming individuals is really romanticized at the end. I feel like that you get this little bit, they're like, oh, I'm going to go off and I'm going to do this. And I don't remember exactly what they said, but it was along the lines of, well, I'm going to go and write poetry and I'm going to go and stare at a sunset and that type of thing. And I just feel like they were clearly steering you in a particular way. There was this very romantic idea of, oh, well, it's these things that they... And I'm like, why couldn't you have just as a unit gone and stared at a sunset and then gone and written some poetry afterwards? I don't know.
Arguably, you could say that all of us are Borg-like in this regard, that left to our own, literally, strictly speaking, left to our own devices as individuals, we're not going to survive very long. We need each other as a species and as a society and in the civilized world. So, are we essentially Borg that need to rejoin the collective. Do we come together for survival, and is that a good thing, or do the virtues that we get from being strong, rugged, autonomous, pick yourself up by your bootstrap individuals, is that an overriding factor? And I think you're right. I think they romanticize the individualism at the end of the episode.
Yeah, I think it depends on how you look at it. So I think if you're talking about collectivism in the sense that everybody's part of a greater unit and everybody performs a role and everybody has things that they have strengths at, then I think, yes, I'm all for that. But if we're talking about, some kind of totalitarianism where, you're told what to think and you're told what to do, then not so much. So it depends on which way you're looking at it.
And clearly the Borg are more like the totalitarian version of collectivism. Sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
And see, I think that individualism versus collectivism, if there is an overall theme of Star Trek Voyager, it really is the debate between these two ideas. And certainly it seems that for the most part, Catherine Janeway is on a quest to really liberate every Borg she can get her hands on, and she's really preaching the gospel of individualism. But this episode takes a lot of really interesting twists and turns, because at the end of the episode, you could almost argue that Lancer and the other Borg would have been better off if they would have been able to remain part of the collective. And it seems like there's a lot of disdain that they have for Seven of Nine for, liberating them to begin with. She's injured them in some way, and now they're individuals, and that individuality is actually going to kill them. And so I thought there were a lot of really interesting twists and turns. This was on my long list, as I said, but I pulled it off because it seemed like it didn't really, and I suppose this is true of Star Trek, but it raised a lot of questions, and it didn't do anything to answer them. In fact, it kind of muddied the waters a little bit.
Mike, I love that you described Captain Janeway as going out and sort of saving each and every lost Borg. She's like the good shepherd of the Borg, right? She'll go out and save every last lost individual.
Yes. Well, out there in the Delta Quadrant, I mean, she's on her own, and it seems like that is her quest out there. She's spreading this idea of individualism, and it's kind of interesting because the idea of the Federation is one of collectivism, although they resent the Borg. In fact, Janeway calls it, evil because of their collective nature.
Well, I think Star Trek actually has kind of a unique combination of individualism and collectivism. Star Trek basically, I think, argues that in being more collectivist, that allows us to overcome our innate human limitations and allows us to become more fully authentic individuals, because we don't have to worry about those limitations that come to the forefront when we are ruggedly individual. So Star Trek, it's not. I don't think of Star Trek as being more individualist or more collectivist. I think Star Trek uses collectivism to overcome our limitations, and in doing so, allows human individuality to become its fullest flower.
Yeah, and I think that is a really interesting point. And actually, the nuance of that, where it's a combination of the two, is actually really highlighted earlier in Voyager. There's this struggle that Seven of Nine has when she's trying to balance the idea that she's an individual and she's been encouraged to be an individual, and yet she still has to follow the rules. And there's actually a quote that she says. I forget the episode that it's in. I know it's fairly early on. I think it's in series 4 or 5, but she sort of says, well, you encouraged me to be an individual, and now that she's done this thing that Janeway's not happy about, and now you're telling me I can't do whatever I want. And obviously that nuance is something that she really struggles with.
There is that tension. In fact, one of my alternate mentions here was the episode Good Shepherd. And in that episode, remember the crew members who are not able to function aboard Voyager, they're almost too individualistic. They're too much of a special flower. They don't fit in with the group. They don't know their function. And so for Janeway, her reaching out to them as individuals is to bring them in line with the group and get them functioning as a cohesive unit back on board Voyager.
Yeah.
It just strikes me that Good Shepherd is a really, maybe a simplistic, but an important account of philosophy philosophy of education, that if you really want to reach people, if you really want to change their behavior, if you really want to get them learning the things you want them to learn, it takes involvement from the instructor. It takes some hands-on experience. It takes being proactive. This isn't Janeway in front of a lecture, in front of a whiteboard in a lecture hall, lecturing at them, telling them what to do. She gets down in the weeds and really becomes the good shepherd, reaching out to them, helping them to become the best versions of themselves by going on an away mission with them. So it just strikes me that Good Shepherd is a really modern account of what education should be like in this more immersive relationship-based model of education. So last on my list of honorable mentions is Unimatrix Zero Part 1. And I love that episode because it raises this issue we've talked about before on Metatreks of Cartesian skepticism and the problem of the external world. If you can create this artificial environment that is indistinguishable from the actual real world, that should raise a skeptical question of how do we know we're not inside Unimatrix Zero? How do we know we're not inside of a holodeck? And Star Trek explores this idea of Cartesian skepticism in many different ways. It's almost very similar to what you get inside the Matrix trilogy as well. How do you know that you're not immersed in some virtual reality artificial environment? How can you distinguish between genuine reality from an artificial set of experiences?
That was one of my honorable mentions as well. I wasn't going to talk a great deal about it because I discussed it, as you recall, in our last conversation regarding Star Trek Voyager Essentials from Season 7. I kind of threw in Unimatrix. And as memory serves, I think you gave me a little trouble over that. Because that's
wait a minute, is it season 6 or is it season 7? You're cheating. We need to adopt some sort of rule so this doesn't keep happening, right?
The cheating rule, yes, the cheating rule. The only other honorable mention that I have, and I know it's not a popular episode, but I just really love the juxtaposition of ethics in this episode is Live Fast and Prosper. I'm not going to say a whole lot about it. I really love the comical way that we're able to contrast Starfleet ethics with, these hucksters here in the Delta Quadrant, these Delta hucksters. So I just, a lot of fun, but a really fun way of juxtaposing those two ethical standards.
In all seriousness, I think it's not obvious at all that everything that Voyager does in the Delta Quadrant is benevolent, right? There's always whoever's on the receiving end of it, whoever Captain Janeway decides not to share technology with, or whenever she decides to actually violate the Prime Directive, there's always the other side of the coin. So the fact that Voyager is developing something of a reputation, whether or not these hucksters are the cause of that reputation, doesn't surprise me at all. That some people are going to love what Voyager is doing in the Delta Quadrant, some people are going to be really resentful, and it depends on what your perspective is on the receiving end of whatever Voyager does. So yeah, Voyager's got a reputation in the Delta Quadrant for sure, partially as a result of these people. What do you think about this episode, Kay?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I think that when we sort of hear about Voyager having this reputation, because I think this isn't the first time that we've heard about that. I think we've had that mentioned on a number of previous occasions by various people. Oh yeah, we've heard of you, so and so. And I think the idea that they then decided to do this episode, and then there's this really interesting question about all these people who've said that in the past. Well, which Voyager did they actually meet? I just think it's an interesting one that sort of, it almost makes you think back on things that have happened previously and thought, well, I wonder how this interaction with these people went if it was the other Voyager or this alternate fake Voyager that they met rather than the real one.
Are you saying that Captain Janeway is a captain of ill repute? That's a little harsh.
Only in Resistance.
Well, Kay, you get the last word. Do you have anything else on your list? Any honorable mentions or other episodes that you'd like to mention as part of your essentials list?
Well, I had a couple of others that I toyed with the idea of putting on. One that I picked because I thought it was really interesting. Yeah, I didn't actually put it on my list because I felt like the point in it was quite a small point that was the reason why I was considering it, but it was the episode One Small Step, which is the episode where they discover this spacecraft that was from back in the early days of the Mars missions on Earth that they'd never known what had happened to. And there's this whole resistance from Seven of Nine of why are we bothering to do this, blah, 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 our history is irrelevant, etc. And then by the end of the episode, she comes to realise and have a reverence for this guy and what he achieved and his contribution to not just the history of humans in general, but her history personally. And I just found that really interesting. But the reason I didn't put it on my list was because I thought Memorial was a more interesting history episode, and I thought they were quite similar in that way of like, how do we look at history?
Kay, I think this is a really important concept. In fact, the title of our Voyager podcast, To the Journey, implies that there's something important or meaningful to the journey of exploration. And it's fun to see Seven of Nine come to realize that being part of this long-term journey of human exploration is meaningful and interesting and can be exciting. It adds something to our lives. And that's a very Star Trek perspective on the trajectory of humankind into the future as we explore and space and explore knowledge and all the things they do in Star Trek. But it's Seven of Nine has to come to the realization that those things actually matter.
It seems like a lot of the episodes that we're choosing for our lists, we mentioned this earlier in the podcast, seem to hover around the theme of history. And my question is, if the overall theme of Voyager is, as I suggested, individualism versus collectivism, do you suppose that there is some purpose here in Season 6 for Seven's development particularly that suggests that in that quest for individualism, there is something to be said for the understanding and, as Kay said, the reverence for history?
Well, I think there's something of a false dichotomy between individualism and collectivism in this regard. Insofar as Seven of Nine is becoming liberated from the Borg and becoming comfortable with her own individuality, she's also becoming comfortable with being human again and being a member of us as a class, as a species, as a group. And that becomes part of her human identity, even though she's trying to become a strong individual after having been liberated from the Borg. So I think being part of the human story is part of her identifying with her humanity, not just her individuality.
Yeah, I think as a member of the Borg, having the entire sort of memories of all the Borg, available on tap, as it were, and the nature of them, I feel like she's never really got any questions during that time about who am I, how do I fit into this, etc. And it's only once she actually sort of leaves the Borg and starts becoming part of humanity, and because she's not had any of that sort of, she has the memories of the Borg, but it's through a very different lens. She's not been taught history in the way that we learn history. She's not been taught about the reasons why we find looking at history important and why we have a certain, as I said before, reverence for it. And it's her coming to realise that and understand that in a more organic way rather than it just sort of all being in her head from the start.
When you put it that way, Kay, it strikes me that Seven of Nine learning to be an individual is actually easier than her learning to be part of humanity. Captain Janeway can teach her to be an individual. She can just say, look, you're not part of the Borg anymore. You can do what you want now. Mm-hmm. You can, if you have a hobby you want to do, you can do it. If you want to eat this versus eat that, you can do it. So you're an individual. Yay. But teaching her to be part of the human race as a group is much subtler and much harder and takes longer for Seven of Nine to really get a handle on than viewing herself as an individual.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find it interesting that at times we see the Doctor perform that part of the role for her, teaching her about how to be human, because he doesn't necessarily understand that himself.
In all of its messiness, yeah.
Yes.
Well, I just want to go on record and say that I am Team Doctor and Seven of Nine as far as that goes.
Join the club. Yeah.
But I will say that this episode, and I'm glad you mentioned it because it was on my long list. This episode gave me another one of my favorite Star Trek guest performances, Phil Morris as Lieutenant John Kelly. I mean, at the end of the episode, this guy ended up on my wall of heroes as well. I really loved his performance. I had such an appreciation for what he brought to the episode, and again, probably only Jeffrey Combs would have been able to do that part any better.
Yeah, absolutely. He absolutely nailed it. While we were talking about Star Trek regulars, though, I forgot that we should have mentioned when we were talking about Survival Instinct, Vaughn Armstrong.
Yes. Familiar face there, definitely.
Yeah.
Of course, it's probably easier to find episodes where he doesn't have a guest performance, and he's done so many.
Yes.
He's done so many.
Yeah, he really has.
Any other episodes on your list, Kay?
Well, the only other one that I had down that I thought I might mention was Barge of the Dead. So this is the episode where B'Elanna starts to have these sort of visions, if you like, of the fact that her mother is in hell, Klingon hell, and she needs to go and save her, basically. And we get all these interesting hallucinations, for want of a better word, or visions of her on this barge, and we get quite a sort of look into the sort of Klingon mythos and stuff like that. But the reason I found this really interesting was because there's a very interesting debate around the fact that she wants to go and pursue this, and she wants to go and do it, and there's an element of it being quite dangerous for her to go and pursue it and go into these visions again, because it's causing her potentially physical harm. And initially Janeway doesn't want to let her do it, so I found there was a really interesting debate to be had here around sort of people's duties in Starfleet and what they have agreed to when they sign up for Starfleet versus being able to practice their own individual beliefs. And this is a theme that comes up time and time again in Star Trek, but I thought this was a really good example of it, that, you know, Janeway's reluctant to let her do it, and she has to balance this idea of individual freedom. Again, individualism versus collectivism. There you go.
Well, I like to think of this episode as B'Elanna's Inferno, but but that aside, it strikes me as related to this question in philosophy of law of the extent to which people should have the ability to do things that aren't in their own best interest. Right? There's lots of things that are not in my own best interest that aren't illegal, that I'm not prohibited from doing by law. Right? That doesn't mean they're good for me. It doesn't mean they're smart. It doesn't mean they're wise. And then there are some things where some issues where the law steps in and says, nope, that's too far. That's really not in your own best interest. Like, that's why we have seatbelt laws, and that's why we have, prohibitions against things like suicide. There's just certain things boundaries we place on individual liberty for the sake of the collective good. And so it's an interesting question. Even though this is not necessarily in B'Elanna's best interest, it's dangerous, as you put it. Should she have the right to do that as an individual, or is Captain Janeway justified in saying, nope, you're crossing a line, you've gone too far, I'm stepping in as captain and establishing some boundaries in what you're allowed to do?
Yeah, we see this exploration a lot with Worf in the Star Trek universe. I thought it was really interesting that we get to see this with another Klingon, and in particularly a female Klingon, because again, I think there are some differences in the way that we approach these characters, because one's male and one's female. But I also think that it's fascinating to me that Janeway's interpretation of how far is too far honestly was somewhat different than what I would have expected from her.
Yeah, I think she really takes the hard line quite quickly as well. And that is not what... Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's not necessarily what we've come to see from her in terms of her allowing people to pursue their own beliefs outside of their duties, if you see what I mean. She really did. I mean, obviously B'Elanna persuades her eventually, but...
Well, guys, I'm going to do a quick recap of our episodes. Our list of essentials, we begin with Memorial, Dragon's Teeth, Blink of an Eye, which made it onto all of our lists, Ashes to Ashes, Voyager Conspiracy, Survival Instinct. We have a few honorable mentions: Good Shepherd, Unimatrix Zero, Live Fast and Prosper, One Small Step, and Barge of the Dead. And that, listeners, is Metatrek's Essentials for Season 6 of Star Trek Voyager. Any final thoughts?
Well, like I said at the beginning of the show, Season 6 of Voyager is one of my favorite seasons, not just of Voyager, but of Star Trek in general. So I had a fairly long list of episodes to draw from. I was frankly surprised to realize that so many episodes from this season of Voyager touch on this issue of the interpretation of historical events in one way or another. It's a theme that seems to run through the season that I hadn't recognized till we started drawing attention to it today. Yeah,
I realized that whilst I was sort of looking through the list, when I was contrasting like Memorial and One Small Step, for example, I thought, oh, well, that's a fairly similar theme there. I guess Identity is probably another quite similar theme. I'm just thinking because, we talked about Ashes to Ashes, and again, in one small step, Seven's identity as who she is, part of humanity, etc. So maybe that's another theme there.
Yeah, perhaps so. Perhaps so. Yeah, apart from what I've already said, as I mentioned, individualism versus collectivism, I think, is the broad thread throughout Star Trek Voyager. And I do think that this season is heavy on content that deals with the nature of history and how history plays a part in our personal development. And I'm really glad we had this conversation, because I hadn't really made that connection so much until we sat down and talked about it.
I actually think that the fact that this season focuses so much on history reveals something in general about the soul of Star Trek, because Star Trek could very easily just be pure futurism, right? You know, humanity into the future has become a technological society with all the bells and whistles and gadgets that defined life in the 23rd and 24th century. But that's not all of Star Trek, right? Star Trek is constantly drawing you back into the human condition. And part of what it means to be human is to be part of human history. And I think it's just interesting that for such a futuristic show to keep turning the clock backwards and focusing on how we got there, the journey from there to here, as we talk about on when we talk about like Enterprise, for example, that it says something about what matters to the Star Trek universe. It's not just the futurism, it's not just the gadgets, it's not just the ethical dilemmas, all the philosophical content we talk about, but it's being part of the human story and the human, and that includes human history.
Indeed.
Yeah, and I think also as well, that's a way that we end up feeling more like this is something that realistically could be where we are in the future, because they keep on tying it back. It's not just all futuristic and, you know, everything that we can't recognize. It's that the people there are almost looking back on us. That's an interesting thought.
Well, Kay, we're really, really pleased you could join us today. We've been talking about trying to find a way to get you on Metatrex for quite a long time. You've been with us as an associate producer for a long time. And like we mentioned at the beginning of the show, you're one of my co-hosts on To the Journey, in which we talk about Voyager all the time. So you and I are definitely going to pick this up with Suzanne and keep talking about all these issues as we talk about, life aboard Voyager over on To the Journey. But before we let you go, do you want to give us your contact information and let all of our listeners know where else they can find you on the Trek FM network and around the internet?
Yeah, sure. Well, as you've already mentioned, you can find me on To the Journey. I'm also quite often hanging out in the Babel conference. So if you're on there, you can look me up and say hi. And also you can find me on Twitter. My handle is Choco Weeble.
All right, Kay. Well, thank you again for coming aboard the Starship of Theseus. I just got a hail from your shuttle. They need to get you back to the Daystrom Institute so we don't miss your Midas Array window. We don't want you to lose your window to get back to the Delta Quadrant. So, Transporter Chief, energize. Well, Zachary, it was so much fun to have Kay aboard the Starship of Theseus. I know, as you said, we've been trying to do that for quite some time, and I'm really glad that we were able to make the connection and really appreciated her insights and her thoughts on essential episodes from Season 6 of Star Trek Voyager. As I said before, I've not been the Voyager wonk, perhaps, that you are, but I do have a great appreciation for Season 6. Again, some of my favorite episodes in this particular season. So I'm glad we were able to have the conversation. I really appreciated what Kay was able to bring to the conversation as well.
Well, like I said, Kay's been with us for a long time on Metatrex, and even though she's not on mic each and every week, oftentimes we're talking about these issues behind the scenes. Almost every episode of Metatrex results in some further conversation. So I'm just glad we got a chance to bring her aboard the podcast. And for me, I almost get tired of hearing myself talk sometimes. Like, you know, you and I have done 56 episodes of Metatrex now, and to the point where you and I can almost guess each other's responses. And for me, some of the fun of having a guest on the show is to just get someone else's perspective on some of the things that we know we're going to talk about anyway. So I really enjoyed getting Kay's perspective on this today, and maybe we'll bring her back again next time we get a chance to talk about Voyager on another episode of Essential Trek Philosophy.
Truly.
Well, it's been fun talking about Essential Trek Philosophy from Voyager Season 6, and we'll be back next week with a regular episode of Metatrex, but this isn't the only thing we've been talking about here on Trek FM this past week, so here's a quick look at some of the other things you may have missed elsewhere on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, Standard Orbit.
It was kind of a creepy, scary, very intense episode. I really like this episode because it pulls you in and it seems very realistic. And
so
I
like
love when
Mary.
it does it.
You're a
like
Mary fan.
Yeah, I like
so
it.
Mary was one of the ones I was kind of jokingly referencing, where it's like, well, if you leave this one out of the rotation, it's not really gonna hurt anybody.
Oh, I definitely thought you meant the next one.
No. Well, maybe so.
Earl Grey.
And there's these spooky aliens, and like they look like ferrets, and they're fighting, and like Picard is like possessed by this like thunder and lightning, and the crew are like are gonna go up against him, but they're like, no, we gotta respect the law, man. And it's like that, if you respect the law, someone will end up being a cloud, man.
To the journey.
What would you have done?
Well, I'd have programmed my tricorder, open the door, lob it in, shut the door quick. Try that first of all.
So you would lob a tricorder probe
Hope it
into the
doesn't
holodeck.
break as it lands.
Well, you could wrap it in some gaffer tape or something.
Some bubble wrap.
The 602 Club.
That feels like a turning point in the movie where they seem to go toward this moral of the story that they even repeated at the end, which is, don't be so busy trying to make a life that you forget to participate in the present of where you are.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out these shows and find out what we're talking about in your favorite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button. That helps us out greatly, and it makes it easier for other listeners to find the show as they search iTunes. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Stitcher, TuneIn, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and of course you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website and grab the RSS link as well. Another way you can help us keep all of our shows coming to you each week is to become a patron of the network through Patreon. If you visit patreon.com/trekfm, that's patreon.com/trekfm, you'll find our current goals and different milestone contribution levels, along with all the great perks we have for you. These perks include early access to content, exclusive content, producer credits, seats in our content development team, and many more. We really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/trekfm. And don't forget to check out Enterprise in Space, a project of the nonprofit National Space Society that will design and launch an 8-foot orbiter and return the craft to Earth. The NSS Enterprise orbiter will carry more than 100 student-designed science experiments into space, and you can help make it happen. Visit enterpriseinspace.org to find out more and to get your seat on the mission. If you'd like to contact us with feedback or suggestions for the show, or to send us your thoughts on anything we discussed in this episode of Metatreks, you can contact us in several different ways. You can contact us via a form on Trek FM's website. Just go to trek.fm/contact.
You can also look in the sidebar on the show page or go to speakpipe.com/trekfm and leave us a voicemail.
On Twitter, you can find us under the handle @TrekFM.
On Facebook, just go to facebook.com/trekfm, and while you're there, check out our listeners-only discussion group, the Babel Conference. Just simply type the Babel Conference, that's BABEL, into the search field on Facebook, or go to our website at trek.fm and click discussion on the menu bar. It is a closed group, but if you click subscribe, one of our admins will let you right in.
We'd also really appreciate it if you took the time to leave a rating and a review of Metatreks on iTunes. We'd love to hear your feedback and suggestions for the show. Well, Mike, when you're not liberating drones from the collective, where can our listeners find you on the interwebs and around the Trek FM network?
Well, Zachary, you can always find me on Facebook. That's where I'm most active. Always glad to talk about Star Trek and philosophy in the Babel Conference. On Twitter, my Twitter handle is @cmichael1701. I'm also on Instagram, cmichael1701, and you can also catch me around the network on recent episodes of The Ready Room and Warp 5. And Zachary, when you're not formulating your latest Voyager conspiracy theory, where can our listeners find you around the interwebs and on Trek FM?
Well, you can find me elsewhere on the Trek FM network as co-host of To the Journey, Trek FM's Voyager podcast, along with my co-host there, Suzanne Williamson, and someone named Kay Shaw, who has something to say about Voyager from time to time. You can also find me on Twitter. My handle there is just my name, @Zachary Fruhling. That's Zachary, Zachary, and Fruhling, Fruhling. And you can always find me in the Babel Conference if you want to talk about Star Trek and philosophy with me there. We'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the rest of the Metatreks team from the network. Specifically, we'd like to thank C. Brian Jones, the founder and publisher of Trek.fm, our executive producers, Matthew Rushing and Kenneth Tripp, Aaron Harvey, our art director, Richard Marquez, our production manager, and our Patreon manager, Brandon Shea Mutala. We'd also like to give a special thank you and a shout out to our 4 associate producers for Metatrex. We'd like to thank Patrick Devlin. You can find Patrick under the Twitter handle @MagicDrop5. Someone named Kay Shaw. You can find Kay under the Twitter handle @ChocoWeeble. Norman Lau. You can find Norm under the Twitter handle @Starfighter1701. And we have a brand new associate producer this week on Metatrex and going forward, Kit Lofstad. And you can find her under the Twitter handle @MotherCat. That's mother with a 0. Well, everyone, thanks for listening to Metatrex, a Star Trek philosophy podcast. Until next time, when we will once again boldly go where no philosophers have gone before.